Welcome to Philosophy Insights. Today we're looking at an interview where Jordan Peterson responds to the criticism he hears the most. Various public figures complain that postmodernism is actually completely opposed to Marxism. So for Jordan Peterson to put them together is obscuring the facts. Here is his response.
Often use postmodern Marxism as a catch-all term for wokeness. Can you explain what you mean considering both schools of thoughts are diametrically opposed?
Like the postmodernists care about that. Like, I just hate this criticism. It's like, well, do you know they're contradictory? It's like, yes, actually, I do know. Do they? No. And you say, well, you know, they're diametrically opposed. It's like, yes, I know that because the postmodernists are skeptical of grand narratives and Marxism is a grand narrative. Let's point that out. Okay, so then why were all the French postmodernists Marxists? Because they didn't care about coherence. How about that? Or how about maybe they were trying to justify their own narcissistic drive to power? How about that? You explain it. Why were all the French intellectuals Marxists in the 1960s and the 1970s until Solzhenitsyn published the Gulag Archipelago, in which case they were still Marxists, they just went underground because they were all so embarrassed, as they should have been. You know, Sartre, Marxist, communist, Derrida, Foucault. Derrida wrote a book on the relationship between his philosophy and Marxism, right? It's not my imagination. And so people say, well, don't you know that there's a contradiction? It's like, you think deconstructionists care about contradictions? What It's irrelevant. And why did they, what would you say, sort of divert towards Marxism or default towards Marxism? I don't know, maybe because academics are jealous of rich people. I don't bloody well know. Well, I've seen that among academics, you know, they're hyper intelligent, generally speaking, and competent in their domain, but they don't make that much money compared to rich people, and that irritates them a lot. And so what do? Well, they criticize capitalism. It's like, well, they're completely 100% protected by capitalism. They're the most protected people the world has ever generated, and unbelievably ungrateful. And they want to have their intellect and the protection of the capitalist system and simultaneously be friend to the poor. And I've watched what sort of friend to the poor most left-wing academics are. And I can tell you, man, you have a friend like that, you don't need an enemy. So.
One interesting detail, JeanPaul Sartre, probably one of the biggest French intellectuals in the 40s and 50s, even defended the Soviet during the regime of Stalin. Sartre was so much into the communist idea that he ran with the narrative that the terror of the Communist Party was necessary to build the socialist ideal. Only very late Sartre turned his back on Stalin. Here are some further details on Dorita by Peterson.
Foucault and Derrida, it's like, well, we don't believe in grand narratives except for Marxism. It's like, that's real convenient, boys. And has anybody pointed out the contradiction? Well, you know, us French intellectuals, we don't talk about that. It's like, yeah, no kidding, you don't talk about it. Because it's scandalous, to say the least. To be a Marxist? To be a Marxist now? Really? After, what, 120 million deaths? How much bloody evidence do you need? And the answer is, I'm so arrogant that all those corpses make no difference to me. And that's the answer. So, yes, I'm perfectly aware that the deconstructionists and the Marxists exist at odds with one another.
But they do have something very similar in common, which is that they both see the notion that quantity devours quality, that the mass takes over the hierarchy, and that we destroy, invert, subvert any form of hierarchical structure.
Yes, that's true. That's a good observation. Yeah, so you see that in Derrida, right? Because Derrida is all... For Derrida, Western culture was logocentric, which is exactly the case you just made, right? That we have something at the center and that it's hierarchical and it's patriarchal. It's like he's right about that. And we should bring the margins in. That's Derrida's idea because he's a clown, a fundamental. I mean, he's a joker, really. Yeah, I mean that. He's a trickster, Derrida, right to the core, absolutely, 100%. And he's full of tricks, and that's one of the tricks, is to bring the margins into the center. And he knew perfectly well that if you bring the margins to the center, you just have a new margin, which is why we have Christian satirists now like the Babylon Bee, you know, it's because everything's upside down.
Yeah.
And so the normative has become marginalized.
I don't think even he could predict the Babylon
No, I don't
Bee.
think so either.
I don't think that's possible.
I don't think so either. It's like, when did the Christians become funny? It's like when the world turned upside down.
That's right.
Well, it's so weird. It's like, because I've watched the Babylon Bee guys, and I watched their interview with you, which was like the weirdest interview I've ever seen in my life. These crazy frat boy Christian fundamentalists, which is weird enough in itself, interviewing you about sacred architecture and monstrous gargoyles in Renaissance architecture and the relationship between that and cognitive categorization, and then making like weird frat boy jokes the whole bloody time while you were keeping up with some producer laughing maniacally in the background. It's like, oh, wow, so this is where our culture's at. So it was strange.
There's indeed a tight connection between Marxism and postmodernism, even though postmodernists wanted to be seen as critics of Marxism. This is true. However, what they did is to turn from the working class bourgeois dialectic to the dialectic between various other so-called dominant and oppressed groups.
I suggested that postmodernism was a way for the Marxists to keep going under a new guise. I suggested that Marxism was fundamentally based on hatred rather than sympathy and empathy. I suggested that the corpses were the evidence for that. I told you why I think postmodernism is fundamentally wrong. But now I want to talk to you a little bit about white privilege. So the first thing that and I haven't got this quite figured out yet. I can't quite figure out why the postmodernists have made the canonical distinctions they've made. Race, ethnicity, sexual proclivity, sexual gender identity, let's say. Those are 4 dimensions along which people vary. But there's a very large number of dimensions along which people vary, right? In fact, given that there's an infinite number of ways of interpreting the world, you could immediately point out that there's an infinite number of dimensions along which people vary. And so then the postmodern question is, why would you privilege some of those dimensions over the other? And I would say, well, because it sustains your bloody Marxist interpretation, that's why. But you're not going to say that because it marginalizes, right? You've marginalized that so you can ignore it. So that's one of the fun things about postmodernism. You can, I have a very vulgar image in my mind, but, but I won't share that with you, but you can infer it. Here's some ways people differ. Intelligence, temperament, geography. Historical time, you live now and not 100 years ago. Attractiveness, that's a big one. That's a big one. Would you imagine you could, we won't go there either. Youth, it's advantageous to be young, you've got potential. It's advantageous to be old, you've got wealth. Health, that's a good one. Sex, women have advantages, men have advantages. Maybe one has more than the other. It's not self-evident. Women live about 8 years longer. They're multi-orgasmic. Athleticism, wealth, family structure, friendship, education. Well, then there's the classic, postmodern ones, race, ethnicity, etc. Why not those other dimensions of variation? There's no evidence that they're less important. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence that they're more important. So, why not consider them? Then you get intersectionality. This is one of the things that's really comical, I think, because the postmodernists, identity politics types, actually realized this. They thought, well, okay, race and gender. Fair enough. Well, what if you're a black woman? Well, that's a problem because, well, now you've got 2 dimensions of differentiation. What the hell are we going to do about that? And what if you're gay and black and female? Well, then what if you're not very bright and gay and black and female? And then what if you're ugly and not very bright and gay and black and female? And you can keep playing that game. You can keep playing that game an infinite number of ways because there's an infinite number of ways to categorize things, as the postmodernists already pointed out. And so the intersectionality theorists came along to plug the hole, but they don't know where they're going. They don't understand that the logical conclusion of intersectionality is individuality. Because there's so many different ways of categorizing people's advantages and disadvantages that if you take that all the way out to the end, you say, well, the individual is the ultimate minority. And that's exactly right, and that's exactly what the West discovered. And, the intersectionalists will get there if they don't kill everyone first.
Thank you for watching this video, and if you like the content, subscribe to Philosophy Insights.